At 1213 hours on the 8th of June, 1943, Ensign Tsutomu Takahashi stood on the deck of IJN Mutsu, watching the flying cadets from Tsuchiura Naval Air Group Mill around No. 3 turret. 113 cadets, 40 instructors, all aboard for familiarization training, learning about the battleship that symbolized Japanese naval power, second only to Nagato. Mutsu and Nagato are Japan's pride. The phrase everyone knew, the ships everyone recognized. Takahashi saw smoke, not the usual funnel exhaust. This came from near No. 3 turret. Aft, port side, brown smoke curling up into the humid air above Hashirajima anchorage. He turned toward it. Others noticed. Someone shouted. The smoke thickened. Then everything ended. The explosion tore through magazine No. 3 with the force of 300 tons of cordite and black powder primers detonating simultaneously. The shockwave propagated outward at supersonic velocity. The aft section of the ship, everything abaft, No. 3 turret, separated instantly. The hull severed cleanly. 535 feet of forward section began rolling to starboard. Water rushed into the boiler rooms, into the main engine room. Into every compartment the explosion had opened. The forward section capsized in seconds. 1,474 men were aboard. 353 would survive. The stern section remained upright. It floated. The after turret pointed skyward at an angle no turret was designed to assume. Inside, men who had survived the initial blast found themselves trapped in a hull segment tilting backward, filling with water, offering no escape routes. The stern floated for 14 hours. At 0200 hours on the 9th of June, it slipped beneath the surface and came to rest a few hundred feet south of the main wreck. Mutsu, the second ship of the Nagato class, one of the big 7 battleships permitted to carry 16-inch guns under the Washington Naval Treaty, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, symbol of national power and technological achievement, was gone. 1,121 men died, most instantly, some trapped and drowning. The question that would haunt investigators for the rest of the war and decades beyond was simple. Why? In June 1916, the Imperial Japanese Navy authorized construction of 1 battleship under the fiscal year 1916 budget. The ship would be named Nagato after Nagato Province. In June 1917, 3 additional capital ships were authorized. 1 battleship, later named Mutsu after Mutsu Province. 2 battle cruisers that would become Amagi and Akagi, both later converted or planned for conversion to aircraft carriers under Washington Treaty restrictions. The authorization came in response to American President Woodrow Wilson's announcement of plans for 10 additional battleships and 6 battle cruisers. Japan needed to respond. The 8-8 fleet plan required 8 battleships and 8 battle cruisers. This was the minimum force considered adequate to contest American naval power in the Pacific. Commander Yuzuru Hiraga, though often credited, was not the original designer of the Nagato class. He was reassigned to the Navy Technical Department responsible for ship design after Project A-102 had begun. But on the 12th of June 1917, Hiraga proposed a revised design incorporating lessons from the Battle of Jutland, fought the previous year. Project A-125. The modifications were substantial. Better boilers, smaller but more efficient, reducing the total from 21 to 12 while maintaining the same power output. This freed space and weight for a 5th twin turret. The secondary armament was reduced from 20 guns to 16 but raised higher for better arcs of fire and less weather interference. Most critically, Hiraga specified 845 caliber 410 mm guns, 16.1 inches. The United States Navy had planned to arm its Colorado class with 16-inch guns before the Nagato class was designed. But Nagato would be the first dreadnought launched carrying guns larger than 15 inches. This made headlines. This made Mutsu and Nagato symbols of Japanese technological achievement and naval ambition. The first ships in the world with 16-inch main armament, the most powerful battleships afloat when they commissioned. Mutsu was laid down at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal on the 1st of June 1918, launched 31st of May 1920. The fitting-out phase extended into 1921. Installation of the main armament. 841 cm 45 caliber, Type 3 guns produced at Kure Naval Arsenal. Delayed completion until October. She commissioned on the 24th of October 1921 under command of Captain Shizen Komaki. Length overall 215.8 meters after various modifications. Beam 29.3 meters. Draft 9.18 meters at standard load. Standard displacement 32,720 long tons. Full load 39,116 long tons. Crew 1,333 at commissioning, increasing to 1,475 by 1942. Propulsion was provided by 4 Gihan-geared steam turbines, delivering 80,000 shaft horsepower to 4 shafts. 21 compound water tube boilers initially, 4 oil-fired and 17 mixed coal and oil firing. During the major reconstruction between 1934 and 1936, these were replaced with 10 oil-fired boilers. Maximum speed 26.5 knots. Cruising range 5,500 nautical miles at 16 knots. This was battlecruiser speed in 1921. No contemporary battleship could match it except her sister Nagato. The main armament consisted of 8 .45 caliber 41 cm Type 3 guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward in superfiring arrangement, 2 aft also superfiring. The turrets were hydraulically powered. Elevation range -2 to +35 degrees initially. Increased to -3 to +43 degrees during reconstruction using turret salvage from the cancelled Tosa-class battleships. This increased maximum range from 30,200 meters to 37,900 meters. Rate of fire approximately 2 rounds per minute. A special Type 3 sank incendiary shrapnel shell was developed in the 1930s for anti-aircraft use. The 885-kilogram armor-piercing shell could penetrate 350 millimeters of face-hardened armor at 16,000 meters. Secondary armament comprised 20-50 caliber 140 millimeter guns mounted in casemates on the upper hull sides and in the superstructure, reduced to 18 guns during reconstruction. Anti-aircraft armament in 1941 consisted of 850 caliber 127 mm guns in 4 twin mounts and 20-25 mm Type 96 guns in 10 twin mounts. This would be continuously upgraded through the war. Had Mutsu survived to 1945, she would have carried the massive light anti-aircraft batteries typical of late-war Japanese capital ships. Armor protection followed the all-or-nothing scheme. Main belt 305 mm, maximum thickness, tapering to 102 mm at the lower edge. Deck armor 69 mm over engine rooms, plus a 25 mm upper deck layer. Turret faces 305 mm, barbettes 350 mm above deck, 280 mm below, conning tower 369 mm sides and roof. This was designed to resist plunging fire from contemporary 16-inch guns at battle ranges exceeding 20,000 meters. The ship that resulted from this design was magnificent. The pagoda mast structure, added during reconstruction, rose 7 decks above the upper deck. The distinctive profile became instantly recognizable. The speed was exceptional for a heavily armored battleship. The firepower was the most powerful in the world until the British Nelson class commissioned in 1927. These were the ships that would defend the empire. These were the symbols that proved Japan had arrived as a first-rate naval power. But there was a problem: the Washington Naval Treaty. On the 6th of February 1922, delegates from the United States, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy signed the Washington Naval Treaty limiting capital ship construction. Existing ships could be retained. Ships under construction could be completed with restrictions. New construction was severely limited. The treaty specified that battleships under construction should be scrapped. Mutsu had been launched in May 1920 but was not yet commissioned. The American delegation proposed she be scrapped. The Japanese delegation refused. Intense negotiations followed. The compromise was extraordinary. Japan could retain Mutsu. In exchange, the United States could complete 2 additional Colorado-class battleships beyond the one already permitted. Colorado and West Virginia. Britain could build 2 new battleships, which became Nelson and Rodney. This created the Big Seven. 7 battleships worldwide permitted to carry guns larger than 15 inches. 2 Nagato class, 3 Colorado class, 2 Nelson class. These 7 ships represented the pinnacle of pre-treaty battleship design. They would remain the most powerful battleships in service until treaty restrictions lapsed, and the next generation of super battleships, Yamato, Iowa, Vanguard, commenced construction in the late 1930s. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, later commander of the Combined Fleet, famously complained, "For the sake of one Mutsu ship, Britain and the United States were made too strong." This was accurate. Japan retained one battleship. Its potential enemies gained four. The strategic implications would become clear later. In 1942, when Japan faced American and British naval power across the Pacific, those additional treaty battleships would matter enormously. But in 1922, Mutsu was saved. She became a symbol of national pride. School children had donated funds for her construction. The public knew her name. The Navy could not admit that diplomatic negotiations had forced them to scrap a ship the people had paid for. Mutsu survived because domestic politics would not permit otherwise. Strategic logic had been sacrificed for public relations. Through the 1920s and 30s, Mutsu served as backup flagship of the Combined Fleet when Nagato was unavailable. On the 4th of September, 1923, she loaded supplies at Uchinura Bay, Kyushu, for victims of the Great Kanto earthquake that had devastated Tokyo and Yokohama. With Nagato, she sank the hulk of obsolete battleship Satsuma on the 7th of September 1924 during gunnery practice, fulfilling Washington Treaty requirements to reduce the number of capital ships. She served as flagship for Emperor Hirohito during 1927 naval maneuvers. Captain Mitsumasa Yonai, later Prime Minister, commanded her from November 1924. Between 1934 and 1936, Mutsu underwent major reconstruction. Torpedo bulges were added, extending the beam to 34.59 meters. The bow was extended, improving seakeeping. The stern was rebuilt. The machinery was completely replaced. All coal-firing capability was removed. 10 new oil-fired Kampen boilers were installed. The forward funnel was removed, replaced by a single large funnel amidships with the distinctive funnel cap. The superstructure was rebuilt in the pagoda mast style, increasing height dramatically for better visibility and fire control. Additional armor was added. Deck armor increased. Barbette armor increased. Turret armor increased. The main battery elevation was increased to 43 degrees using the Tosa-class turrets. Anti-aircraft armament was substantially upgraded. The reconstruction increased displacement to 39,130 tons standard, 46,690 tons full load. These modifications kept Mutsu relevant as newer battleships like Yamato entered service. When war began on the 8th of December 1941, Mutsu was assigned to Battleship Division 1 of the First Fleet. She was one of the most powerful ships in the Imperial Japanese Navy. She should have been at the forefront of operations. She was not. Japanese battleship doctrine emphasized preservation of capital ships for the decisive battle, the battle that would decide the war. The modern Tsushima that would cripple the American Pacific Fleet and force a negotiated peace. Every operation was measured against this doctrine. Should we risk battleships now or preserve them for the decisive engagement later? The answer was almost always preserve. On the 7th of December, 1941, while Nagato served as Admiral Yamamoto's flagship and 6 carriers struck Pearl Harbor, Mutsu patrolled the Ogasawara Islands. Deterrence, showing the flag, accomplishing nothing operationally significant. From the 4th to 6th of June 1942, during the Battle of Midway, Mutsu was part of the main body under Admiral Yamamoto, 300 miles behind the carriers, too far to intervene when the battle was decided. The plan had been to lure American carriers into a trap where Japanese battleships could engage them. The plan failed. The carriers were lost. The battleships accomplished nothing. On the 24th of August, 1942, Mutsu participated in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, again as part of the main body, again too far from the carriers to influence the outcome. She was too slow to keep up with the fleet carrier force. After the battle, she escorted damaged carrier Shokaku back to Truk, then returned to Japan. This was her only active engagement, her closest approach to combat. She never fired her main battery in anger. She never engaged an enemy warship. For 21 years of service, she had steamed thousands of miles, consumed tens of thousands of tons of fuel oil, tied up dockyard capacity for multiple reconstructions, absorbed resources that could have built destroyers or submarines, and accomplished nothing strategically significant. By January 1943, Japanese naval strategy was in crisis. The Guadalcanal campaign was failing. Carrier strength had been gutted at Midway and subsequent battles. Fuel shortages restricted operations. The combined fleet was being forced into a defensive posture. Battleships like Mutsu, designed for offensive operations and decisive fleet engagements, found themselves relegated to training missions and transport duties. On the 7th of January, 1943, Mutsu returned to Japan from Truk. She spent the next months at Hashirajima anchorage, training, waiting, consuming fuel, representing power that could not be effectively employed because the strategic situation no longer permitted offensive battleship operations. On the 13th of April, 1943, Mutsu loaded ammunition at Kure Naval Arsenal for operations near Alaska's Aleutian Islands. Following the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands, the operation was canceled. Logistical problems, fuel shortages, the constant refrain of late-war Japanese military operations. She returned to Hashirajima. More training, more waiting. By June, Mutsu had become a training vessel for flying cadets, familiarizing future naval aviators with capital ship operations. This was useful, but hardly the mission a battleship was designed for. On the 8th of June, 1943, Mutsu was moored to buoy number 2, designated for the Battleship Division 2 flagship. Approximately 3 kilometers southwest of Hashirajima Island, just west of Mitsuhima Island in the inland sea. Weather was clear, seas calm, temperature 26 degrees Celsius, humidity high, typical June conditions in the Seto Inland Sea. 113 flying cadets and 40 instructors from Tsuchiura Naval Air Group were aboard. Total complement 1,474 men. 4 ships were in the vicinity. Battleship Fuso, light cruiser Tatsuta, destroyers Wakatsuki and Tamanami, all moored at their assigned buoys. A normal day. Training. Routine. The war hundreds of miles away. At approximately 1210 hours, observers on nearby ships noticed smoke rising from Mutsu's stern. Brown smoke, not white or gray. Brown, thick, coming from the vicinity of number 3 turret. Port side. Aft. The smoke increased rapidly. Some witnesses later said they saw flames, others only smoke. Within 3 minutes, the smoke was clearly visible from all nearby ships. Something was wrong, but there was no alarm, no distress signal, no indication from Mutsu that an emergency was developing. At 1213 hours, the magazine exploded. Witnesses on Fuso, 800 meters away, described a massive orange fireball erupting from Mutsu's stern. The fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. The shock wave propagated across the water. Windows shattered on Fuso. Men were knocked down by overpressure. The sound, a deep bass rumble followed by cracking reports as secondary explosions cooked off, was heard 30 kilometers away on shore. When the smoke cleared, Mutsu was in 2 pieces. The aft section, everything behind number 3 turret, was separated completely. The forward section, 535 feet of battleship from bow to just aft of number 3 turret, was rolling to starboard. Water poured into opened compartments. The boiler rooms flooded instantly. The main engine room disappeared under incoming sea. Men who survived the explosion found themselves in a capsizing ship. They had seconds to reach topside before the roll became irreversible. Most did not make it. The forward section completed its roll and sank in less than 2 minutes. 1,000 people were inside. Very few escaped. The stern section floated. It remained upright. Number 4. Turret pointing skyward at approximately 30 degrees above horizontal. Inside, men trapped in the after sections pounded on bulkheads. Some compartments had survived the explosion relatively intact, but there was no way out. The normal access routes led forward. Forward no longer existed. The men trapped in the stern had 14 hours to contemplate their situation. Some tried to escape through shell holes blown in the hull. A few succeeded. Most drowned when they entered flooded compartments. Others waited, hoped rescue would come. It did not. At 0200 hours on the 9th of June, the stern section lost buoyancy and sank. Everyone still inside died. Drowning, asphyxiation, trapped in sealed compartments as water slowly rose or air slowly depleted. Nearby ships responded immediately. Destroyers Wakatsuki and Tamanami began rescue operations. They pulled men from the water, men covered in oil, men with burns, men in shock. The rescue boats from Fuso reached the area within 10 minutes. They searched for survivors clinging to debris. 353 men were rescued. Out of 1,474, 1,121 died. The casualty rate was 76%. For comparison, when HMS Hood exploded at the Battle of the Denmark Strait. 1,415 died out of 1,418. A casualty rate of 99.8%. Mutsu's explosion was slightly less catastrophic than Hood's, but only slightly. The initial assumption was enemy action, American submarine. The destroyers immediately began dropping depth charges. Sonar searches found nothing. No periscope had been sighted. No torpedo tracks observed. The water in Hashirajima anchorage was extensively patrolled and netted against submarines. An American submarine penetrating that far into the inland sea was theoretically possible but operationally improbable. The depth charge attacks continued for hours anyway. Nothing was found because nothing was there. The Imperial Japanese Navy convened an investigation commission on the 11th of June, 3 days after the sinking. The commission's mandate was to determine cause of loss and recommend preventative measures. The investigation was led by Vice Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu. The commission examined 3 hypotheses: enemy action, internal sabotage, accidental explosion. They interviewed survivors. They examined the explosion site. They reviewed Mutsu's maintenance records, ammunition loading procedures, crew discipline records, everything potentially relevant. On the 25th of June, the commission issued preliminary conclusions, 17 days after the explosion. Well, before the investigation of the wreck was completed, the conclusion was sabotage. A disgruntled crewman had deliberately ignited the magazine. The commission provided no physical evidence for this conclusion. No identification of the specific crewman, no motive beyond general dissatisfaction. No explanation of how access to the magazine was obtained or how ignition was achieved. The conclusion was presented as fact. The case was closed. This was absurd. 17 days was insufficient time to conduct a thorough investigation. The wreck had not been fully examined. Survivors had not been systematically debriefed. Alternative hypotheses had not been adequately explored. The commission had reached a conclusion designed to satisfy political requirements rather than determine technical truth. Sabotage by a disgruntled crewman implied no systemic problems, no design flaws, no procedural failures, no institutional responsibility. The problem was one bad actor who had been conveniently killed in the explosion he caused. Case closed. Move on. The survivors knew better. Multiple witnesses had seen brown smoke coming from No. 3 turret before the explosion. Brown smoke indicated burning cordite propellant. The type: 3 Sankaiden anti-aircraft shells stored in the magazines used different propellant that burned white. Experiments were conducted at Kamega-Kubi Experimental Range at Kure Naval Arsenal. Type 3 shell propellant was burned. It produced white smoke. Standard projectile propellant was burned. It produced brown smoke. Survivors confirmed the smoke they saw was brown. Therefore, the Type 3 shells could not have self-ignited and caused the explosion. But something had ignited the standard propellant. The investigation examined whether the Type 3 shells could self-ignite. These shells were complex, a 16-inch shell casing filled with hundreds of incendiary submunitions and a bursting charge designed to disperse them in a cone in front of enemy aircraft formations. The idea was to create a cloud of burning phosphorus that would ignite aircraft or at least force them to maneuver. The shells were temperamental. The incendiary composition was sensitive to heat and shock. Large numbers of Type 3 shells were stored in magazines on all Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers. If they could self-ignite, every capital ship in the fleet was at risk. The experiments failed to induce self-ignition. The Type 3 shells were subjected to heat, vibration, shock, everything that might cause them to detonate prematurely. They remained stable. The commission concluded Type 3 shells were not the cause. All restrictions on their embarkation were lifted. The shells were again loaded on capital ships. If the investigation was correct, this was safe. If the investigation was wrong, the entire fleet was at risk of repeating Mutsu's fate. Nobody knew which. On the 17th of June, 9 days after the explosion, dive boat No. 3746 was sent down to examine the wreck. This was a small Nishimura-class search and rescue submarine with a crew of 7 officers. It could crawl along the harbor bottom examining wreckage. The mission was to document damage and assess feasibility of raising the ship. At approximately 100 hours, the submarine became snagged on wreckage. It could not free itself. The crew attempted to blow ballast. The connections were fouled. They attempted to reverse. The submarine remained trapped. For hours, the crew worked to free themselves while oxygen depleted. The submarine had enough air for perhaps 12 hours submerged. They had been down 5 hours when they became trapped. 7 hours of oxygen remained, then 6, then 5, outside. Rescue vessels attempted to locate them. Sonar was ineffective in shallow water among wreckage. At approximately 1900 hours, after 18 hours submerged and near complete oxygen depletion, the crew managed to free the submarine. It surfaced. All 7 officers survived. Barely. The mission provided useful data on the wreck condition, but nearly killed an entire submarine crew in the process. On the 22nd of July, divers completed their survey of the wreck. The forward section lay on its side in approximately 35 meters of water. The hull was extensively damaged. The explosion had torn open the stern. Flooding had been catastrophic. The machinery spaces were destroyed. Turrets 1 and 2 were intact, but the mechanisms were underwater and inoperable. Salvage would require cutting away damaged sections, sealing the hull, pumping it out, then attempting to right and raise it. The cost would be enormous. The time required would be measured in years. The Navy leadership briefly considered it. The decision was negative. Mutsu was struck from the Navy list on the 1st of September 1943. The loss was declared a state secret. Mutsu's sinking was not announced. Her name remained on published fleet lists. Official communications referred to her as if she still existed. Survivors were dispersed to various garrisons across the Pacific. Some were sent to Rabaul, some to Truk, some to the Marshall Islands, anywhere far from Japan where they could not spread rumors about what had happened. This was standard procedure for disasters that might damage morale. The Japanese public could not be told that one of the 2 symbols of naval power had exploded and sunk while sitting safely at anchor in home waters. The Americans could not be told because confirming their own intelligence was valuable and might reveal sources. Everyone had to be kept ignorant. The Allies suspected Mutsu's loss by May 1944. Australian military intelligence acquired interrogation transcripts from a captured member of the Corps Special Naval Landing Forces. He mentioned Mutsu's loss during routine questioning. In August 1944, a captured member of the 90th Naval Garrison Unit corroborated the story. He described hearing rumors of an unexplained explosion aboard a battleship at Hashirajima. United States Navy intelligence assessed these reports but could not confirm them. Both sources were describing rumors, not first-hand knowledge. The reports might be true. They might be Japanese disinformation. They might be garbled accounts of some other incident. American intelligence did not officially record Mutsu as lost until after the war when Japanese records were captured and survivors interviewed. In July 1944, the oil-starved Imperial Japanese Navy conducted Operation Take. Bamboo divers descended to the wreck. They cut access holes into fuel tanks. Pumps were lowered. 580 tons of fuel oil were recovered from the wreck. This was desperately needed. By mid-1944, Japan was critically short of oil. Every tanker from the Dutch East Indies faced American submarine attack. Fuel reserves were declining. Recovering oil from a sunken battleship was economically absurd but strategically necessary. The fuel that had been loaded onto Mutsu for operations that never occurred was more valuable in July 1944 than the ship itself had been. After the war, the truth emerged slowly. Survivors were located, interviewed, their accounts compiled. The official investigation report was found in captured Navy records. Post-war analysts examined the evidence. Several theories emerged about what actually caused the explosion. Theory 1 was sabotage. A disgruntled crewman deliberately ignited the magazine. The official conclusion: the problem was evidence. No crewman was identified. No motive was established. No method was described. One survivor mentioned a sailor who had been accused of petty theft and was scheduled to face court-martial on the 8th of June. The theory was that he started a fire as a distraction to escape. His body was later recovered and identified. If he was responsible, his plan failed catastrophically. But there is no evidence he was anywhere near No. 3 magazine when the explosion occurred. His location in the ship at 1213 hours was never established. Blaming him was convenient. It was not proven. Theory 2 was accidental fire. Multiple survivors reported seeing smoke before the explosion. Brown smoke indicating burning propellant. Something had ignited cordite in the magazine. Japanese warships were known for lax safety procedures. Wooden decking, wooden furniture, cotton and wool bedding, flammable insulation, old electrical wiring prone to shorting. Any of these could start a fire. If a fire reached the magazine spaces, Black powder primers were the most sensitive component. Black powder ignites at relatively low temperatures. Once the primers detonated, they would ignite the cordite charges. The cordite would detonate in confined spaces. The explosion would propagate through the magazine. This sequence fits the observed facts. Smoke before explosion. Brown color indicating cordite. Progressive destruction suggesting deflagration to detonation transition rather than instantaneous detonation from a single cause. Theory 3 was ammunition instability. Cordite propellant degrades over time. It absorbs moisture. It breaks down chemically. Old cordite can self-ignite at temperatures below its design stability threshold. Japanese ammunition quality control was variable. Some batches of propellant may have been substandard. If unstable propellant was loaded into Mutsu's magazines and the temperature in those magazines exceeded safe limits, spontaneous ignition was possible. June in the Seto Inland Sea is hot and humid. Magazine temperatures could easily reach 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. If the propellant was unstable, this might be sufficient to initiate combustion. Theory 4 was structural failure. The explosion was initiated by some mechanical failure that created a spark or heat source in the magazine. Hydraulic lines under pressure. Electrical systems shorting. Machinery friction. Any of these could ignite propellant vapor or cordite dust in the magazine spaces. Once ignition occurred, the confined space and available fuel would ensure rapid propagation. This theory requires a specific mechanical failure, but does not require sabotage or pre-existing fire. Theory 5 was enemy action. Not a submarine, a commando operation. British or American special forces infiltrated Hashirajima anchorage, attached limpet mines or timed charges to Mutsu's hull, and withdrew. The charges detonated. The ship exploded. This theory appeared in some post-war accounts from individuals claiming to have participated. No credible evidence supports it. Allied Special Operations records do not mention any such mission. The operational difficulties would have been immense. Hashirajima was extensively patrolled. Security was tight. Infiltration would have required submarine delivery, underwater approach, mine placement, extraction, all without detection. This is theoretically possible but operationally improbable given the defenses in place. The truth will never be known with certainty. The physical evidence is gone. The wreck was partially salvaged after the war, but the critical sections, the magazine spaces where the explosion originated, were too damaged to provide definitive answers. The survivors are nearly all dead. Their testimony was recorded, but it consists of observations from various locations in the ship. None of them in the magazine at the moment of ignition. They saw smoke. They felt the explosion. They escaped or died. What they saw does not tell us why the magazine exploded. What can be stated with confidence is that the official explanation is inadequate. Sabotage by an unidentified crewman with no established motive using unknown methods is not a satisfactory conclusion. It is a conclusion designed to avoid institutional responsibility. Accidental fire seems more probable. Japanese capital ships carried large quantities of flammable materials. Safety procedures were lax compared to British or American standards. Magazine temperature control was inadequate. The cordite was degrading in storage. Any or all of these factors could have contributed. A small fire in crew spaces or electrical spaces could have spread to magazine access routes. Once fire reached the black powder primers, catastrophe was inevitable. The lesson that should have been learned was not learned. Mutsu exploded because of systemic failures in ammunition safety, ship construction, and operational procedures. These failures were not unique to Mutsu. Every Japanese capital ship had similar vulnerabilities. But rather than examine those vulnerabilities and correct them, the investigation concluded the explosion was an isolated incident caused by one bad actor. Therefore, no systematic changes were required. This was institutional denial at the highest level. Mutsu's loss represented the fifth largest loss of life from accidental explosion in naval history. Only the explosions that destroyed HMS Vanguard in 1917, IJN Kawachi in 1918, French battleship Liberté in 1907, and Russian battleship Imperatrica Maria in 1916 killed more men. It was the second worst loss of life from accidental explosion on a ship in World War II after only Fort Stekine's explosion at Bombay in 1944. 1,121 men died. Most instantly, some trapped and drowning, some burned, some crushed by collapsing structure. They died on a ship sitting safely at anchor 300 miles from any combat. They died because something went wrong with procedures or materials or design. They died preventable deaths. After the war, extensive salvage operations recovered portions of the wreck. The chrysanthemum mon, the 1.2-meter imperial crest representing the throne, was salvaged in 1953 but was subsequently lost or scrapped. Number 4. Turret was raised and is now on display at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Iwo. A secondary casemate gun is displayed at Yasukuni Museum. Various other artifacts were recovered. Much of the steel was cut up and reused. Because Mutsu was built before nuclear testing began, her steel does not contain radioactive isotopes present in all post-1945 steel. This makes it valuable for radiation shielding and sensitive scientific instruments. Pieces of Mutsu are still in use in Japanese research facilities for this purpose. In 1978, a memorial museum was opened on Hashirajima Island near the site where Mutsu sank. It displays artifacts recovered from the wreck, a scale model of the ship, photographs of survivors, testimony from eyewitnesses. The museum is maintained by survivors and family members. It is visited by few people. Hashirajima is not a tourist destination. The museum exists to preserve memory, to honor the dead, to remind visitors that 1,121 men died here for reasons that remain disputed. When we assess Mutsu's impact on the war, the conclusion is uncomfortable. She accomplished almost nothing operationally significant. 21 years of service. Midway, where she was too far from the action to matter. Eastern Solomons, where she was too slow to keep up. Training missions, transport duties, then explosion. For the resources consumed to build, maintain, modernize, and operate Mutsu, Japan received negligible combat effectiveness. Those resources would have been better allocated to destroyers, submarines, or aircraft carriers. One battleship that never fired its guns in combat consumed enough steel, fuel, ammunition, and trained personnel to build 30 destroyers or 100 submarines. Those destroyers and submarines would have sunk more American ships than Mutsu ever could have. But this misses the larger point. Mutsu was not built primarily as a combat vessel. She was built as a symbol of Japanese industrial capacity, symbol of Japanese technological achievement, symbol of Japanese great power status. The public called her Mutsu and Nagato are Japan's pride. This was literal. These two ships represented everything Japan aspired to become: a modern industrial nation, a first-rate naval power, an empire that could stand equal with Britain and America. When Mutsu exploded, she took 1,121 men with her. But she also took the illusion that symbols equal substance. She demonstrated that pride in technological achievement does not translate to operational effectiveness. She proved that building magnificent ships to impress rivals is meaningless if those ships cannot be effectively employed in war. And she revealed that institutional denial, the refusal to acknowledge systemic problems, leads to preventable disasters. The official investigation concluded sabotage. Post-war analysts suspected fire. The truth remains unknown. What is known is that 1,121 men died on the 8th of June 1943 because something went catastrophically wrong with a ship that should have been safe. They died far from combat. They died on a ship sitting at anchor undergoing routine training. They died because someone or something ignited 300 tons of explosive in a confined space, and the resulting blast tore the ship in two. Those men deserve to be remembered not as victims of sabotage by a disgruntled crewman, but as casualties of institutional failure. They deserve to be remembered for serving on a ship that represented everything their nation aspired to be, while revealing everything their military failed to address. Today, artifacts from Mutsu are scattered across Japan. Number 4. Turret stands at Iwo, a secondary gun at Yasukuni. Steel from her hull in research facilities nationwide. The Memorial Museum on Hashirajima receives few visitors. Most Japanese know the name Mutsu only from history books. Most remember her as one of the Big Seven. Few remember she exploded at anchor, killing 1,121 men. Fewer still ask why. The answer to why matters. Not because determining the specific ignition source would bring the dead back. Not because assigning blame would provide closure. The answer matters because Mutsu's loss represented systemic failures that plagued Japanese military institutions throughout the war. Failures in quality control, failures in safety procedures, failures in institutional transparency, failures in learning from mistakes. When Mutsu exploded, the investigation took 17 days to conclude sabotage, 17 days to blame a dead crewman who could not defend himself. The same institution that reached this conclusion in 17 days took 4 years to develop adequate damage control procedures for carrier operations. 4 years to realize that wooden flight decks burn. 4 years to understand that aviation gasoline vapor accumulation leads to catastrophic explosions. The pattern was consistent. Deny systemic problems, blame individuals, avoid institutional reform. This is why Mutsu matters. Not because she was powerful or beautiful or symbolically important. She matters because her loss revealed what the Imperial Japanese Navy refused to acknowledge. That pride is not competence. That symbols are not substance. That refusing to learn from disasters guarantees more disasters. When Mutsu sank, the Navy declared it a state secret. Survivors were scattered across the Pacific. The public was kept ignorant. The Allies were kept guessing. Everyone who might have learned from the disaster was prevented from doing so. This was the greatest tragedy, not the 1,121 deaths. Deaths happen in war. What made Mutsu's loss tragic was the deliberate refusal to learn from it. The investigation concluded sabotage when evidence suggested accident. The fleet continued using Type 3 shells when testing was inconclusive. Magazine temperature control remained inadequate when heat was a probable factor. Every systemic vulnerability that contributed to Mutsu's explosion remained unaddressed because admitting systemic vulnerabilities would require admitting institutional failure. When Battleship Yamato sortied on her final mission in April 1945, she carried a crew that had never been told what happened to Mutsu. They knew the ship had been lost. They assumed combat. They did not know she had exploded at anchor from preventable causes because that information was classified. Had they known, would it have changed anything? Probably not. By April 1945, Japan was losing the war. Yamato's mission was suicide, but the crew deserved to know that pride in symbols and magnificent engineering do not guarantee survival. Mutsu had proven that. The institution refused to share the lesson. 79 years after the explosion, the debate continues. Japanese historians examine the evidence. They propose new theories. They interview the few remaining survivors. They inspect artifacts in museums. They analyze photographs of the wreck. The consensus is that accidental fire is most probable. Sabotage remains possible but unlikely. Self-igniting ammunition is plausible but unproven. Enemy action is effectively impossible. The truth remains uncertain because the investigation was inadequate and the evidence is gone. But uncertainty about the specific cause should not obscure the larger truth. Mutsu sank because something went wrong that should not have gone wrong. A ship sitting safely at anchor should not explode. A magazine containing hundreds of tons of explosive should not detonate unless attacked. The fact that it did indicates failure. Failure of design. Failure of procedure. Failure of oversight. Failure of quality control. Failure somewhere in the chain of decisions that led to 1,474 men being aboard that ship on that day with that ammunition, in those magazines, under those conditions. The Imperial Japanese Navy chose to call it sabotage. This absolved the institution of responsibility. This allowed operations to continue unchanged. This permitted the same vulnerabilities to remain unaddressed in every other capital ship. This was the choice that mattered, not the choice of whatever sparked the initial fire. The choice to learn nothing from the disaster. At 1213 hours on the 8th of June, 1943, Ensign Takahashi saw smoke coming from number 3 turret. 3 minutes later, he saw the explosion. He survived. He was pulled from the water by rescue boats. He testified to investigators. He described what he saw. Brown smoke, then orange fireball, then nothing. His testimony appears in the investigation report. Next to testimony from dozens of other survivors, all describing the same sequence. Smoke, fire, explosion, capsizing, sinking. None of them explaining why. We will never know why with certainty. The ship that could answer is gone, raised for scrap, cut apart, dispersed across Japan as salvaged steel. The men who knew are dead. The physical evidence is destroyed. The investigation was compromised by institutional imperatives. What remains is memory. Imperfect, incomplete, disputed, but memory is all that prevents the dead from being forgotten entirely. 1,121 men died when Mutsu exploded. They were sons, brothers, fathers, husbands, friends, comrades. They served their nation aboard a ship that symbolized naval power and technological achievement. They died in an explosion that should never have happened. They deserve to be remembered, not as casualties of sabotage by a faceless villain, not as victims of inexplicable accident, but as men who served faithfully and died because the institution they served refused to acknowledge its failures. That is the lesson of Mutsu. That is why she matters. That is why this mystery endures. Because the question is not merely what caused the explosion. The question is why the institution failed to prevent it, failed to honestly investigate it, and failed to learn from it. Those failures killed 1,121 men on the 8th of June, 1943. Those failures would kill thousands more before the war ended. And those failures, that refusal to acknowledge error and adapt, contributed as much to Japan's defeat as any strategic miscalculation or tactical error. The cursed super dreadnought. That is what some call her. As if supernatural malevolence explains 1,121 deaths. As if fate, rather than institutional failure, sank the ship. But Mutsu was not cursed. She was built by humans, operated by humans, lost through human error, investigated by humans who chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. There is no curse. There's only the consequences of choosing pride over safety, symbols over substance, institutional reputation over institutional reform. That is the mystery of Mutsu, not what sparked the fire. That will remain unknown. The mystery is why an institution that could build magnificent battleships could not build adequate safety procedures. Why a navy that could design revolutionary capital ships could not design honest investigation protocols. Why a military that demanded sacrifice from its personnel could not demand accountability from its leadership. Those mysteries have answers. The institution chose not to seek them. 1,121 men paid the price. We remember them, we honor them, and we ask what might have been different if the truth had mattered more than reputation.